And go. No. All right. The other thing I'm going to do this evening is, in order to see the screen, we're going to dim the house lights just a little bit so that we can see well. And my lovely assistant Jill is going to do that. I also forgot to mention, I want to thank my wife Lori, who's sitting here in the front row, who finished writing this lecture late last night while I was sleeping so I would look good today. So, all right. When I was thinking about what we were going to present on this year, the reason why I decided this topic is because a couple of years ago I began a blog which focuses on biblical studies, but one of the things that I also include from time to time is archaeology. I started the blog really for my students because there's so much that goes on out there that the average person, if they don't know where to look or find this information, I tried to give them the blog as a one-stop place to see that. What I began to discover, though, is I didn't realize just to what degree archaeology was really of an interest to people. These finds that were coming out, claims that were being made, and oftentimes the media will bring something out is in a very sensational manner, and then it disappears after a couple of weeks because the story no longer sells, or some movie star is getting married or something like that, which is, of course, far more important than ancient history. And then what'll happen is we learn more about this artifact, we realize its importance, or we learn that it's fake, but the average person never hears that part of the story. And so, as I was doing that, I thought, all right, maybe that would be a good topic for this year's talk. And then in September, fortuitously, the gospel of Jesus' wife appeared. All right, that Jesus said, my wife. What he said about his wife, we don't know. And so, we will talk a little bit about that tonight. And so with that, what I want to do tonight is I want to just start off just a little bit and talk to you just a little bit about history of biblical studies and archaeology and how it has and has not always intersected. And then I want to give you some examples of fakes and forgeries and the frauds who perpetrated them. Okay, that's who I consider the frauds, the people that do this. I'm going to just talk about them, why they did this, how it came about. We're going to look particularly, a little case study on a particular tomb in Jerusalem that was discovered in 1980. Talk very briefly on the role of biblical studies and archaeology together, and finish off the night with 10 authentic artifacts that actually do have something to say to us when it comes to the Bible. So, we'll get started. When we start talking about archaeology, there really is no exact date for when it started. It's not like someday one guy woke up and said, you know what, I think I'm going to go out and just find an ancient civilization, and started digging up in his backyard and found something. In reality, it's developed over many centuries, and actually people have always had an interest in owning something from the past. There's something about owning the past. Maybe it's because we can't control time, but if we think we own something from the past, maybe we have a handle on time. One of the earliest examples I can think of this actually goes back to the ancient city of Corinth. Many of us will know Corinth because the Apostle Paul wrote at least 2 letters there, actually probably 4 or more. But what many of us don't realize is that as we're reading the New Testament, reading this letter that Paul wrote, is that the city that Paul wrote to was actually a new city. The original Corinth, which we call classical Corinth, was actually destroyed in 146 BC by the Romans. And it sat there in complete ruins for 100 years. When Julius Caesar comes to the throne in 44 BC, he decides he wants to reform Corinth and he wants to make it a Roman city. And he does that, and he actually sends a group of people there. They're actually former Roman slaves that have been freed. They're going to start a new city. And in order to finance the building of this new city, they actually began digging up old Corinth and sending the stuff back to Rome, where they're selling if you will, the antiques of old Corinth. So in reality, it's not really archaeology, it's more of a treasure hunt at this point. Probably the most wide-scale archaeological dig that really began in history is Pompeii in 1748. We knew about Pompeii. They knew how it had been destroyed in the first century by the volcano Vesuvius, but they had forgotten exactly where it was or didn't even know that it existed. It was discovered quite by accident by a farmer that was plowing in his field, and when they discovered it, they realized what they had there, and they began digging out the old city, and if you've ever been there today, I mean, it's literally a complete city that was just covered in ash. But even this, in reality, was not archaeology. It was more of a treasure hunt. They were just uncovering what was there to get what was there and then selling it. Over the course of the next couple of centuries, between the 18th and 20th century, however, archaeology begins to become a science. They begin to have various methods that they use and approaches to digging. They begin to understand that the further you go down, the older you're getting into civilizations. And so archaeology, in the 19th century in particular, begins to develop into a science. At the same time, in the 18th and the 19th century, biblical studies is also becoming influenced by science because of the Enlightenment period. As people are beginning to understand the scientific method, they're beginning to understand the way the world works, they begin applying the principles of science to the study of the Bible. In particular, on continental Europe and places like Germany, for the first time openly, people begin to question the historicity of the Bible. Did Israel really walk through the Red Sea? Was Jonah really swallowed by a whale? These kinds of questions. At the same time, other people continued to hold on to the historical reliability of the Scriptures, and they were in opposition to what became known as the higher criticisms, those people that were using different methods to question the historicity of the Bible. Enter then biblical archaeology. With the beginning of archaeology becoming a science, people began to wonder, can we use archaeology to prove the Bible? To prove that these events really did happen. One particular person who is probably referred to as the Dean of Biblical Archaeologists is William Foxwell Albright. Taught at Johns Hopkins University for many years. To this day, he is still well known in the field. If you go to Jerusalem, there is the Albright Institute of Archaeology. Many of his students are just now retiring and beginning to die off out of the field. And then his grandchildren in the field are beginning to come about. Now, Albright believed that archaeology could help to prove the essential historicity of the Bible. He agreed that at times there were complications with things, that things didn't always make sense, but he thought that if you could work with archaeology, you could try and demonstrate that what the Bible said was for the most part historical. The quote on the screen, the spade in one hand, the Bible in the other, is not one that I've ever found attributed to Albright, but it's actually one that's used in a negative sense by critics. And that's because they see biblical archaeologists as those people who come and they got the Bible in one hand and the spade in the other. They're reading what the Bible says about something, and they start digging up there. And they're going to find what it is that they are looking for. To this day, there is a debate over whether or not Bible and archaeology can or cannot inform one another. I'll give you an example. In the city of David, ancient Jerusalem, Eilat Mizar is digging up what she has declared to be the palace of King David. Now, the problem is this. There is nothing on any of the buildings that she's digging up that says David slept here. Okay? Nothing like that happened. All right? David hadn't thought of that yet. But what she has is she has 2 Samuel that says David built a palace there, and she's got some very large foundation stones to what was a huge building clearly at one time. She concludes, therefore, this must be David's palace. And so there's a lot of criticism of this. They are accusing her of doing archaeology of spade in one hand, Bible in the other. Now, whenever you get these kinds of tensions, there's always going to be somebody there who's going to profit from it. Okay? There's going to be somebody who's going to find a way to use this to his or her advantage. And with that, let's talk about the fakes, the forgeries, and the frauds. In 1868, the Moabite stone was discovered in what is modern-day Jordan. And we're going to come back to the Moabite stone later on in this lecture, so you'll learn more about it later. But the stone was discovered in Jordan. Okay? As you can see up there, it has some relationship to some information we have in the second book of Kings, chapter 3. At the same time that the stone came out, this gentleman here, Moses Shapira, was living in Palestine. Shapira was a Polish Jewish immigrant. He had immigrated to Palestine with his parents, and he was running a store in the old city of Jerusalem. Now, Shapira witnessed what was going on in Europe. The universities and the museums in Germany and France were trying to outbid one another to see who was actually going to be able to buy the Moabite stone, bring it back to their country, study it, and put it in a museum. Shapira sees this. Being an entrepreneur, he actually began to create fake Moabite artifacts, because nobody had ever seen any Moabite artifacts before, and Shapira actually began producing these things. In fact, he created an entire culture that never existed. Pots, statues, all kinds of things, and he was selling them to German archaeologists who had never seen Moabite artifacts before, and they were taking it and studying it. It was influencing the field. There's even one story that he actually went out and actually buried stuff in the sand for archaeologists to find. I'm not so sure about that one. I mean, I'll give the archaeologist a little bit of due, all right? I mean, you start digging up something, you know what it looks like. Now, Shapira's downfall actually came in 1883 when he sold something known as the Shapira strips to the British Museum. In addition to selling fake Moabite artifacts, he got into this business of shipping Torah scrolls from what is modern-day Yemen to Europe. He sold to the British Museum some strips of leather that had writing on it in Hebrew, and it was speeches of Moses from the book of Deuteronomy. He said he had found them somewhere around the area of the Dead Sea. He sold them to the British Museum. The problem is that there was another gentleman, Charles Clermont-Gounod, a French archaeologist, who Shapira would not let him read these strips. Well, when Gounod finally got to Britain, he saw the strips. He declared them to be a fake. At that point, everything Shapira worked for began to come undone, and he eventually ended up committing suicide in a Rotterdam hotel. Interesting backstory. We don't have the Shapira strips. They were destroyed in a fire at the end of the 1800s. But in 1946, when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls along the Dead Sea, people started wondering, wait a minute, did Shapira discover some of the first Dead Sea Scrolls? We'll never know. We'll never know because they're gone. But he did actually create this entire culture that never existed. To this day, there are artifacts that Shapira made in museums throughout Europe. They're not on display, but they're actually still kept, and they're worth some money because they're actually studied from the point of view of art history. Okay? So not everything he did ended wrong. Now, Shapira is an example of somebody who takes something and produces it. Not everybody is into it for the money, though. Sometimes scholars, people in the field who should know better, also will fake things. Paul Coleman Norton was a New Testament scholar. I believe he taught at Yale University. And during the Second World War, he got inducted into the army. He was stationed in Northern Africa. And while he was there, he said that he visited a monastery where he found a Greek translation of a Latin document. And that Latin document being Imperfectum in Mattheum, or 54 Sermons on the Gospel of Matthew. His version, though, was not in Latin, it was in Greek. And he copied it by hand because he said he found a very interesting addition to some of the words of Jesus. At the end of the parable in Matthew 22, Jesus says that the man will be thrown out of the wedding feast, and where there'll be wailing and gnashing of teeth. And it was the gnashing of teeth there was this addition. And here's the addition that Coleman Norton said that he found. And behold, a certain one of his disciples standing by said unto him, Rabbi, which is to say, Master, how can these things be if they are toothless? And Jesus answered and said, O thou of little faith, trouble not thyself. If haply they be lacking any teeth, teeth will be provided. It took 3 attempts for him to finally get it published in a journal in 1950. This is probably one of the best pranks ever pulled on New Testament scholars. The prank was actually finally uncovered by Bruce Metzger, who was a student of Coleman Norton in the 1930s, before Coleman Norton went to fight in the Second World War, and Metzger claimed that he had heard this story already at that point. So now Coleman Norton is different than Shapiro. He's not profiting off of this, but, you know, he pulled the wool over his eyes on his colleagues. What I want to do now, though, is I want to not just talk about these people. I want to look at different artifacts, particularly those within the last 10 years that have been revealed to be fakes or frauds. In 1979, the ivory pomegranate showed up on the antiquities market. The pomegranate is about 2 inches high. It's actually not made of ivory at all. It's made of some other stone, okay? But it showed up on the antiquities market, and what made it so interesting to everybody is, you see these what look like little scratch marks on the top, which is an ancient Hebrew inscription. And that inscription says, belonging to the house of Yahweh and holy to the priests. Now, this thing shows up on the antiquities market. The script seems to fit the time period of ancient Israel, and people declare for the first time that we have evidence for the Temple of Solomon. Because we actually don't have any evidence for the Temple of Solomon. Part of the reason is because where Solomon's temple was built, upon that, once the Babylonians destroyed that, Ezra and Nehemiah built a temple on top of that. King Herod came and built a temple on top of that. Then the Romans came and destroyed that. And then the Romans came and built a temple to Jupiter on top of that. And then that was turned into a church by the Christians. And then that was turned into a mosque by the Muslims. You get the point? And that mosque today is the Gold Dome of the Rock in Alaska Mosque. You can't do excavations on that site. You will start World War III. Okay? So you can't do any kind of controlled, proper excavations, and so there's no way for us to prove archaeologically on that site that this is where Solomon's temple was. So when this came out, everybody was like, wow, this is really great. In 1988, the Israel Museum paid $550,000 for this 2-inch piece of stone pomegranate. In 2004, a team of experts put together to investigate it determined 2 things. The pomegranate is ancient. The inscription is not. What they discovered is unlike Shapiro, who was manufacturing everything, they actually took an authentic artifact and then they put an inscription on it, which would actually help to fool the experts, and it made it worth more. Okay? To this day, the debate still surrounds this. There are some who still insist that the inscription is authentic. For the most part, consensus is against it. If you visit the Israel Museum today, you can still see the pomegranate. It is still on display. When you spend $550,000 on something, you don't put it away very quickly, do you? Okay? But next to that pomegranate is a sign which says, there is a debate about whether or not the inscription on this is authentic or not, although they do believe that the pomegranate is. Now, the reason why archaeologists, after 16 years of displaying this, decided to recheck it was because of another artifact that surfaced. In the year 2000, what is known as the Jehoash inscription surfaced on the antiquities market. The Jehoash inscription was claimed to have been discovered in the dirt fill that came out of the Temple Mount. Underneath the mosques that I told you we can't excavate, they are all run by the Muslim authorities. They were digging out underneath the mosque to build a bigger prayer room area, and they were dumping the dirt in the Hinnom Valley. The people that had this claimed that they found it there among those materials. How many people here when we had Dr. Burkai about 6 years ago, okay? And he is actually doing a sifting project, sifting that dirt and discovering what they can from that. That's as close as we're going to get to excavating under the Temple Mount, okay? What makes this inscription so interesting, however, is that it seems to parallel very nicely with 2 Kings chapter 12, where we have the description of Jehoash's repairs to the temple. When this thing appeared for the first time, archaeologists and biblical scholars alike were saying that if this thing is authentic, this would be the first time we had such a close parallel like this to something right out of the Old Testament. The problem, however, is it was just too good to be true. And so they began an investigation And they went and they actually raided the home of the man who had actually introduced it to the world. And then they raided a warehouse that he was running, and they discovered what was, they believe now, a 20-year-long forgery ring, producing fake artifacts to be sold to the public. Because like I said in the beginning of the lecture, people want to own the past. There's a market for it. And so these people were actually there spending their time, well, not spending their time, spending their time and taking our money, okay? More recently, in 2011, we had discovery of the so-called lead codices. You may or may not have seen these little books, and they are little. They're like those little children books you used to get with Peter Rabbit and stuff like that. They're not much bigger than this. They are made of lead, bound together. They have some inscriptions as well as some other markings on it. When they were first presented to the world in 2011, it was claimed that they contained information about the final years of Jesus' life. And everybody was like, oh, wow, okay. However, they are most certainly fake. First of all, more than 70 of these things exist. Now, the sheer number of 70 of these things doesn't automatically discount their authenticity. But when you've never heard of these things for so long, and all of a sudden there's 70 of them, either somebody hit a whole pit full of these things, or somebody's producing them. What they discovered, though, is when these texts were actually able to be read by experts in the field, they discovered that these texts do not contain any information about the final years of Jesus' life. Instead, what it is somebody went into the archaeological museum in Amman, Jordan, and copied inscriptions off of monuments and tombstones. So instead of having a text about the final years of Jesus' life, what you have instead is this: oh, our wonderful son Abgar, how we miss you. May you rest forever in eternity. May the gods be with you. I don't remember that from the New Testament. David Elkington, who was promoting them and who put himself out as a supposed expert in all sort of fields, was found to be a fraud, and he owes the Queen of Romania something like 50,000 pounds because she invested in these things, and then when they found to be a fraud, now he owns this queen, and one should never tick off a queen. So, all right, so Elkington is another example of a possibility of somebody just producing them. Let's just take a look more concentrated at a case study, because we've looked at artifacts that are completely manufactured. We look at artifacts where the artifact is authentic but the inscription is not. Another way that people can actually perpetrate fakes on us is they take authentic finds, and it's how they interpret it and spin the information. So, in 1980, a tomb was discovered in Jerusalem, in the neighborhood what is known as Talpiot. They were building an apartment complex there. Bulldozer uncovered the tomb that you see on the screen. It is most certainly a first century tomb. We know this by the architecture and the style of the inside of the tomb. Okay? Also, what helps us know it's first century is that inside the tomb there were 10 ossuaries. Now, an ossuary, and I have one here tonight from our archaeological collection, an ossuary is a limestone bone box, and it was a particularly Jewish way of burial, and it only lasted for about a period of 100 years. It comes in sometime around 35 BC, and by the end of the first century AD, it's fading away. And basically the way it works is this. Let me just say this, it was also only used almost predominantly in the surrounding area of Jerusalem. Okay? Jews, when somebody would die, they would take their loved one, they would put them in a tomb, they would leave them there for a year until the flesh had decayed, and then they would come back and they would have the ossuary. The ossuary would then be the place that they put the bones of the deceased. The ossuary usually is about the size of the femur bone. That's how the size. They determine it by the size of the femur bone. They're made out of limestone. They're made out of Jerusalem limestone, a particular kind of limestone that you only get in that area, and they usually come out of one block of limestone. Over 900 tombs have been excavated in the environment surrounding Jerusalem. Well over 1,500 or more ossuaries have been discovered. Between 20 and 40% of them have inscriptions on them, because that's one of the things that people would do. When they would gather them back together, they would put them in here, and they would write sometimes the name of who was in here. But it was also not uncommon to also bury not just the husband, but maybe the wife. So if we open up an ossuary, we might actually discover that there's 2, maybe even 3 people inside of an ossuary, all their bones. And so, the archaeologists and the specialists have to work with that. The Talpiot tomb, however, had 6 ossuaries that were inscribed out of the 10 that were discovered there. Okay? Now, the archaeologists, when they pulled out these ossuaries and they read the inscriptions, these are the names that they found in Aramaic. Yeshua bar Yosef, or Jesus, son of Joseph. Maria, which is a Latinized form of the Hebrew or Aramaic Miriam. Yossi, which is basically Joey. To this day, there are people in Israel named Yossi. Okay? Yehuda bar Yeshua, Judah, son of Jesus. Mariamine Emerah, we do not know this name. And then finally, Mattia, which might be Mattia. It could be like short for Matthias, or like Matty, or something like that. And so these are the 6 names they found in that tomb. Archaeologists documented the tomb, and in agreement with the Orthodox Jews of the day, they reburied the remains that were in the ossuaries, because the Orthodox Jews are not very happy when you open up a tomb. So the archaeologists agreed, okay, we will take the bones and we will give them a proper burial once we're finished studying them. The ossuaries were then put in storage. The Israel Antiquities Authority has a huge storage place in Bet Shemesh, and they put it away. And 27 years later, the Discovery Channel decided to reinvestigate this. And the investigation was headed up by 3 people. This man, Simcha Jacobovici, also known as the Naked Archaeologist. Already you're impressed with his credentials. I do not know if he digs naked. I do not want to know if he digs naked. James Tabor, who teaches New Testament at the University of North Carolina, who also wrote a book called The Jesus Dynasty. I think you'll understand what he was doing with that book as we go on tonight. And the special was produced by this man, James Cameron, film director, who you may know better for this scene. Already I can tell you can see where this is going. When they returned to investigate this, and let me start by saying that this is a 2-hour special on Discovery Channel, and it's literally impossible for me to actually untwist all of the knots they tied themselves into to prove their case. I'm only going to hit on a few things, but if you want to watch it, you can get it on YouTube. I mean, they found the ossuary of Peter and everybody, okay? We're not going to go there. Their main claim, though, is that this tomb is the lost family tomb of Jesus. Okay? They say that the Jesus, son of Joseph, is Jesus of Nazareth. That Maria is Jesus' mother. That Yossi is Jesus' brother, which is possible, because we do know that Jesus had a brother named Joseph. It shows up in both Matthew and Mark, and in some Greek texts, the name is actually Yossi. Mariamine Emerah, they said, was Mary Magdalene. In order to do this, they actually had to go to a 4th century copy of something called the Acts of Philip, where Mary Magdalene may be known as Mariamine. There's still a lot of debate around that. And, of course, then they said that Yehuda bar Yeshua is the son of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Now, you're seeing where this is going. Jesus was never raised from the dead. Actually, this is all Da Vinci Code type stuff. They married, okay? They got married. They had a son, and they lived in hiding. This is their family tomb. And Jesus was buried along with not just his wife and son, but his mother and his brother, Yossi. They proved their case in two ways. There's other ways, as I said, they made connections, but these are the two underpinnings of their case. First of all, they used a statistical study commissioned by the Discovery Channel that concluded the probability factor of 601 of this being the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth. Basically what they said, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is where are you going to get all these names that we already know connected together? What are the chances of that happening in one tomb? The other thing that they did was they did a DNA test. They used myocardial DNA on the bone fragments. Now remember, they already buried the remains, but they went in and they scraped around and they took some dust out and they were actually able to get some bone fragments. In fact, inside of this ossuary is a tooth. I do not know if it's from an ancient Jew or an archaeologist who hit his mouth when he was discovering it, but there is a tooth in there. Now, myocardial DNA can only tell you if they are maternally related, i.e., not mother and child or brother and sister. The conclusion of the people in the Discovery Channel special is, therefore, they must be husband and wife, because they took the bone fragments from the Jesus ossuary and what they're calling the Mary Magdalene ossuary, and they did not have the same mother. The plot thickens. When the IAA, the Antiquities Authority, put the ossuaries away, one went missing, but of course, right? In 2002, another ossuary surfaced on the Antiquities market bearing an inscription. Jacobovici and Tabar both surmised that this is the missing ossuary from the Talpiot tomb, and the ossuary is this. You may have heard about it. James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus. This ossuary surfaced in 2002. It was hailed to be perhaps the ossuary belonging to Jesus' other brother, James. We do know that Jesus had a brother named James. Not only do we have an epistle that bears his name, we hear about him in the book of Acts. Josephus even tells us how he died. He was executed in Jerusalem. And everybody was saying, could this be his ossuary? They flew the ossuary over to Toronto in November of that year. Some of us were there. You got to go through. We got to look at this. Oh, is this the ossuary? And all the experts were looking at this, trying to study it. And here is the inscription. Across the top, you can see it scratched out. Here it is, just darkened a little bit. Yaakov bar Yosef, Yohah Yeshua. Okay, Yaakov, by the way, Jacob is how you say James in Hebrew. Now, even as far as the inscription goes, there's a lot of debate. It could be that we have a completely authentic inscription here. Everything on there could be authentic, is what they say. Or the first half could be authentic, and some entrepreneur went and said, oh, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, I'm going to sell it. Whether this inscription is authentic or not, what really complicates the case for the James ossuary is the presence of this gentleman. This is Odad Galan. Odad Galan is the gentleman who presented the James ossuary to the world, arranged for it to be flown over to Toronto in 2002, where myself and my friends were there, got a chance to look at it. Unfortunately, it was Odad's apartment that was raided in 2002, and they discovered the factory where basically they were producing all of these antiquity forgeries. He's the guy who also introduced the Jehoash stone. Basically, like Shapiro before him, well over 100 years ago, eventually time just caught up with him. There was about a 5 to 7 year trial. It ended only in March of last year, so less than a year ago. And the judge acquitted Odad of forgery. There wasn't enough evidence to say that he actually forged it. Okay? He did not declare whether or not the ossuary and the inscription is authentic or not. The backstory to this is that there is actually an Egyptian gentleman who used to travel back and forth between Egypt and Israel who has claimed publicly that he was forging inscriptions. He refused, however, to travel to Israel to serve as a witness in the trial, probably afraid that once he got there, they wouldn't let him go. So the fact is, we still don't know a whole lot about this until we actually get all the information. But we're going to throw this out of the mix because it's just too complicated with the forgery. The other thing is To think that archaeologists would take 10 ossuaries out, find 6 inscriptions, miss one that's the 7th, and that's the one that shows up. It's just too good to be true sometimes. Let's talk about some problems then with the conclusions that we have with what they're doing with this tomb. First of all of the names in the tomb are quite common from the first century. There are 6 different Marys in the New Testament alone. Now, just a short little book. You got Mary, his mother. You got Mary, the sister of Martha. You got Mary, the mother of James and John. You've got the other Mary who's at the tomb. I forget the other 2. I have it someplace. I'll be sure to prove it to you. All right? There's a book that's been put out in 2002. All of the known names we know from inscriptions and writings and everything. The top name that we know from this time period is Mary. It's estimated that 25% of the women during this time period were known as Mary. There are 4 different Jesuses in the New Testament. So which one did I give my heart to, right? No, okay. There is Jesus of Nazareth. There is Jesus Barabbas. Not too many people know that the Barabbas' other name was Jesus, Matthew 27. There is a Simon Bar Jesus, or Simon, son of Jesus, in the book of Acts. And then we have somebody known as Jesus Justus, who is one of Paul's co-workers in Colossians. It's estimated that 4% of the population went by the name of Jesus, Yeshua, okay, which means God saves. If we read the first century historian Josephus, contemporary of the New Testament, he names 21 different people by the name of Jesus. That means that there were 21 other people that were well enough known that he could name them and somebody would know who they are. Just because you have a cluster of names that shows up in a tomb doesn't mean that you can suddenly jump to the conclusion, as Tabor and his friends do in the documentary, that therefore this must be the Jesus family tomb. Because life is a lot more complicated than that, and you'd be surprised at the things that happen. Let me give you a little bit of an anecdotal example here. On Morgan Avenue, where my wife Lori and I live, there is John and Lori. That is us. We live in a white house on the right-hand side of the road as you drive down, as opposed to the field side. One of us works in education. We do not have children. 6 doors down from us is the other John and Lori, who also spell their names exactly the same way, who do not have children, who one of them is working in education. They live in a white house on the same side of the street. Now, at that point, the similarities end, because I called John this week. Didn't tell you that, did I? And said, okay, when were you married? When's your birthday? Who's your parents? Things like that. And it falls up. But the fact is, coincidences happen, and you need a lot more than just simply names. The other problem is that their statistical analysis is flawed. Now, I am not the greatest mathematician. My wife has the business degree. I do not. For a long time, I said we had a checks and balance marriage. I wrote the checks. She balanced it. Okay? But Discovery Channel hired this person to do the statistical analysis. Now, this person clearly knows more than I or any of us probably in this room know. However, he was only working with the information that was given to him. And that's where the problems begin to come in. There were 10 ossuaries in the tomb, but only 6 had inscriptions. The fact that you've got 4 ossuaries in the tomb with no names on them throws an anomaly into the formula. Because even though we don't have names, that means we have 4 possibilities that would throw off who these other people are and their identity. Okay? There could have been a Simon or somebody else in there. So that throws off the analysis. They threw out the name Mattia because there's no match for it in the New Testament. But they also should have thrown out Mariamene because that name does not show up in the New Testament. They actually had to go 400 years later to get that name. The name Yehuda Bar Yeshuda just simply adds to the non-matches. In the end, the only possible matches you have are Jesus and Mary, of which I've already demonstrated to you, you know more Jesuses and Marys than you thought you did. Okay? The other problem runs into the DNA test. The DNA test that they ran can only determine if they had the same mother. What it doesn't tell us is, did they have the same father but two different mothers? It's not unusual for women to die in childbirth in these days and die younger, and the man to marry another woman and have other children by him. Or even more complicated is, if this is a multi-generational tomb, which they were, we have 10 ossuaries in there. We could have great-grandma and grandpa, great-grandma, on and on. You get the point? We do not know what the relationship of all of these are. So simply having 10 ossuaries in this tomb doesn't work for them. Okay? It's not the tomb of Jesus. This is an example of taking good information and interpreting it in a way that you want it to go. Another thing that I have not mentioned today is this type of burial was reserved mostly for the rich. It happens mostly around the area of Jerusalem. The average poor citizen was actually given a dirt grave with stones piled over top, and we don't have a whole lot of evidence for that because dirt graves disappear, as do the bodies and eventually even the bones. Jesus was not rich. Everybody agrees that he was from Nazareth. The idea that Jesus would have a very richly ornate tomb in Jerusalem for his family simply just doesn't fit the evidence. This is not the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth. These guys are not letting this go, by the way. They had another Discovery special last March where they investigated a tomb right next to it that they're claiming is the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and we don't even want to get into that. That's another lecture in itself. Okay? With that, then, the gospel of Jesus' wife, which, we're talking about Mary and Jesus being married together. Let's talk about this. I heard an awe. You're disappointed about this? I hope not. I hope I don't ruin this for you. In September of this last year, Karen King of Harvard University announced the existence of a papyrus fragment. The fragment is only about this big. It is written in Coptic, which is an ancient Egyptian language using Greek characters. Karen King presented this fragment in early September to a group of papyrologists, which is a fancy name to say people who study papyrus. She was in Rome when she presented this, and she told us that the translation that she found on there, that one of the things that it said is, Jesus said, my wife. And then the fragment is cut off. We don't know what Jesus said about his wife. If you are fans of the Daily Show, Jon Stewart, he went on and said, Jesus said, my wife, if I had one, or, he filled in the blank. Jesus said, my wife must like curry, or, he went on all these things. But it just simply says, Jesus said, my wife. Now, in defense of Karen King, when this first came out, she presented it to some experts in the field, and they drew some very cautious conclusions. She is not suggesting that this is by any means evidence that Jesus was married. Okay? If it's authentic, what it might actually be evidence for is that we know that people at times have asked, was Jesus married? It doesn't say he was. Does that mean that he wasn't? That this may actually be evidence of people who wondered about that or thought that he was or should have been married and therefore wrote a document about it. When it first came out, I mentioned my blog to you, I and many others were actually praising Karen King, saying, this is good, this is the way archaeology and discovery should be done. You bring them out, you present them to the experts, they're studied so we can find out what happened. Unfortunately, within about 3 days, we also found out that there was going to be a special on in 2 weeks on the Smithsonian Channel. Which means that prior to her presenting her material to all of her peers, she was already filming a special on the gospel of Jesus' wife. All of us cried foul. In fact, the outcry was so bad, and it actually literally happened across the blogosphere first, and then it started hitting the media. Smithsonian pulled the special, okay, and it wasn't long after that that the story quickly began to unravel. As people began looking at the fragment and the copies that they got of it, several Gospel of Thomas experts noticed that there was a lot of close similarity to wordings in the Gospel of Thomas. And they suggested that this was either an ancient or a modern fake, that maybe somebody in antiquity had copied from the Gospel of Thomas and added in this thing about Jesus said, my wife, or it was something modern. And this is the great thing about social media. This is going on through blogs, email, and Facebook. I'm not kidding you. All over the place, people in the field are talking about this. It turns out, although we don't know for sure, that the fragment may have actually been copied from a Gospel of Thomas on the internet. And the giveaway may be a typo. Now, in this fragment, and I will admit I do not read Coptic, so I am depending on the expertise of my colleagues in the field, but in this fragment, they all agree that missing in the line is a direct object marker. Don't you wish English had those, right? This is the direct object, you know where it is, right? Well, this is missing it. And what they couldn't figure out was, if they're copying this from the Gospel of Thomas, and we do not know of any copy of the Gospel of Thomas with this kind of a typo, why would you not be more careful about this, whether it's ancient or modern? Well, one gentleman who was an expert in the Gospel of Thomas actually at one time had actually produced his own version of the copy of it, and he offered it on his website in a PDF format. And he was looking through his own work, and lo and behold, guess what he discovered in his own work? A typo in exactly the same place. So now, nobody can say for sure. It's possible that there's a typo. I mean, crazier things have happened, okay? But this is really beginning to look bad. The other thing is, we're waiting for ink tests. If you were to flip this papyrus over, the other side also has writing on it, and it's not near as dark as this writing is. It's actually quite light, and it actually looks a lot more like we would expect it to be, being 1,600 years old. It looks like it was re-inked. In fact, some of the places you can see the letters look a little fat. Everybody has your Coptic, okay? Ken, do you have Coptic? A little. Would you? No, it's okay. So either somebody re-inked it, if it's an authentic papyrus fragment, maybe they re-inked it and made the letters say what they wanted it to say. Quite possible. The ink tests were supposed to come out by the end of October. They did not. Harvard Theological Review has now refused to publish Karen King's findings until the ink is actually demonstrated to be ancient. 2 weeks ago, we were informed that there is still yet a delay on this. All right, you've seen the fakes and the frauds. Before we actually look at the authentic ones tonight, let's just talk a little bit about the role of archaeology in biblical studies. How do the two actually work together, or should I say, should they work together? First of all, the Bible, archaeology actually takes us out of the text and into the world of the Bible. When you read, whatever you read, but particularly fiction or something like the Bible, you actually create that world in your mind. There is an action of the imagination going on. You imagine what it looked like, what the people looked like, okay? This is the problem with going to see movies sometimes after you've read books, okay? Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, they don't look how I expected it, right? You develop this imaginary thing. Archaeology helps us to actually move out of that world into the way it actually looked. At the same time, it helps us to recreate the setting by interacting with what we refer to as material culture. Something like an ossuary, a pot, all right, a comb, things that people used every day. And that's how we learn from archaeology and help fill out the picture of the Bible. So for instance, archaeology helps us to learn how people lived and died. There aren't very many descriptions of houses in the Bible. We know they had roofs and doors and houses, but it's only because of archaeology that we know that the typical Israelite home was 4 rooms held up by 4 pillars in the middle. We know that there were tombs. We know, particularly from the story of Lazarus and Jesus, that these tombs were not only carved out of rock, but there was a stone rolled in front of them. But there's no mention of ossuaries anywhere in the New Testament. Archaeology helps us to understand what burial was like and tombs were like in those days. What they ate. At the dig where my students and I work at Gezer, we discover fish bones and we discover something else. I don't know what that was all about. We discover fish bones and olive pits, but if you actually end up missing, somebody leaned against it, that's what it was. If we discover pig bones, though, our suspicion is this is not an Israel site, but a Philistine site. Okay? How the economy worked. Taxes. something near and dear to our heart now that the 2% has gone back up on Social Security and our paychecks. Okay? We know that they talk about taxes in the Bible. Solomon, we know, really taxed the heck out of his people. He ended up splitting the kingdom over it. But how did they collect taxes? Well, archaeology has helped us know, and some of our students from this seminary have discovered these. They are jar handles from jars. And on the jar handles are stamps. And in the stamp it says in Hebrew, Lamelech, which means for the king. And so what archaeologists surmise is that the king's tax collector would go around to the different cities and drop off a jar with this stamp and say, this one gets wine, this one gets oil, this one gets flour, and taxes were paid in kind. And he came back several months later to collect those jars. How cities were fortified. You read the book of Joshua and Judges, and you go in and you read, okay, they're afraid, but why? Why? Okay, so they had walls. Archaeology, when we begin to uncover these fortifications, we go, wow, okay, now we see why this is going on behind the story. It's rare for archaeology to prove the Bible. Very rare. That's not what archaeology is about. It's also unusual to find an artifact, an inscription, or something that has direct relation to or bearing on the Bible. Most of it is stuff that fills in background information rather than something that specifically speaks to something that's going on in the text. And actually, some cases, it only complicates the picture. For instance, if you read the book of Joshua, it reads as if though they went in and they destroyed all these cities in one fell swoop. The archaeological record is a little more complicated when we look at it. And so we're forced to stop and say, okay, how should we understand this? How should they inform one another, if at all? With that in mind then, let me introduce to you, I think I've got 9 or 10 different authentic finds. And I want to just tell you about those finds and close with this tonight and how they actually do relate to our understanding of the Bible. The first and probably the most famous one that I'm sure you're all aware of is the Ark of the Covenant. If you've not got to see it yet tonight, it's next door in the Bible Museum. Please do not touch. It will not end well. No. I wish we would find the Ark of the Covenant. I don't think we're going to. I didn't choose these based on their importance. I chose them on interest. Whose interest? My interest. Okay. The Merneptah Stele, a monument erected by the Pharaoh of Egypt, Merneptah. When he comes to power, all of the other kingdoms around in Libya and Cana and Syria that were serving his previous king, they all rebelled. So Merneptah had to go around the world and kill a bunch of people and make them become their servants again. And when he got home, he felt so good about what he did, he decided to erect a monument to himself about all the people he subjugated. And in this monument, there is one line that reads, you can see it there, Canaan is plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome. There's still a city of Ashkelon to this day. Gezer, where my students and I have worked, has been captured. Noam is made non-existent, and he must have done a good job at that because I do not know about that city at all. Israel is laid waste, and his seed is not. Haru, which just means the basic area of all Syria, is become a widow because of Egypt. This is the earliest non-biblical evidence we have for anything about a people called Israel. Outside of the Bible, this is the earliest we have. And it doesn't really prove anything to us other than somebody there was named Israel. It doesn't say that the Exodus really happened or not, just because this is from Egypt. All it tells us is that we know that there was a group of people that were known as Israel at that time. The Moabite stone, which we started off early about, this is the stone that got Moses Shapira in so much trouble. This was found in 1868. It's the longest Iron Age inscription ever found in the region. Talks about military campaign. Also introduces us to the Moabite language. It provides background to the story in 2 Kings 3, which is this. In 2 Kings 3, Mesha, the king of Moab, has been a servant of the king of Israel, paying his taxes and tithes to this king. One day he says, I've had enough. I'm not doing this anymore. The king of Israel, Omri, says, well, I'm not having any of this either. So he decides to go off to war. On his way to war, he stops into Jerusalem and he says to the king of Judah, Jehoshaphat, hey, you want to go with me? I'm going to beat up the king of Moab. Jehoshaphat says, well, heck, I'm not doing anything today. Why not? Let's go. Somewhere along the line, they pick up the king of Edom. These three kings show up, and I'm going to shorten the battle scene here, but they get to the point where they're laying siege to the Moabite city. They're coming very close. The battle is moving against Moab, and Misha, 2 Kings tells us, on the city wall sacrifices either his own son or the king of Edom's son. Depends how we interpret that text. And the battle suddenly turns against Israel, Judah, and Edom, and Moab stays free. Misha set up this stone, and in this stone he talks about how Chemosh, the god of Moab, had been angry with his people, allowed them to become subjugated to Israel, but in turn, eventually he returned, assisted Misha to throw off the yoke of Israel. Does it prove that the story happened exactly the way the Bible said? No. But what it does give us is it gives us another view. It gives us the side of the story from the Moabites. And it's interesting. Just as the Israelites thought God was on their side in the battles at times, so did the Moabites. The Lachish relief. Lachish is one of the fortress cities that lay along the Mediterranean Sea. Gezer, where my students and I have worked, is another one of them. And these were cities that were there to protect Jerusalem up on the hill. In 2 Kings 18, we have a mention of how Sennacherib and the Assyrian army is laying siege to Lachish, and they're sending messengers up to Jerusalem to Hezekiah, letting Hezekiah know, we're coming for you next. Now, eventually what happens in 2 Kings is that the angel comes, sends a plague, a bunch of Assyrians die, and they leave. But when they excavated the palace in Nineveh, modern-day Iraq, they found this. It's a relief. It's in the British Museum, and this is the siege of Lachish. Here is Lachish, the Israelite or the Judite city. Here are Syrians building a siege ramp. Here is the siege machine, and they're going up. What gives us a very small mention about a city in the Bible, we find out from the Assyrians, was actually quite an important battle. Another thing that I don't have to show you tonight, but it's in the University of Chicago Museum, is what is known as the Sennacherib prism, where he actually talks about how he caged up Hezekiah in Jerusalem. He doesn't mention that he got defeated in battle there or not. So again, does this prove the Bible? No, that's not the purpose of archaeology, but it gives us the other side of the story. It fills it out a little more for us. Probably one of the most important discoveries, however, in the last 20 years has been the Tel Dan inscription. Discovered in 1993 in the ancient city of Dan, which lies on the border of Israel and Lebanon. This inscription gives us the first mention of something known as the House of David. Until 1993, we did not have one shred of evidence outside of the Bible that there was anybody named David. It was so bad, in fact, that people began to think that David and Solomon never really existed, and that this is nothing more than King Arthur's Camelot, a mythical beginning to talk about where the kings of Israel and Judah came from. But during this excavation at Tel Dan in 1993, they discovered this broken monument inside a wall, and when they translated it, it's actually a monument by an Aramean king talking about how he defeated both Israel and the house of David. Now, does this prove everything that the Bible says about David killing Goliath and his great kingdom? No. But it provides a connection for us that says, okay, we do have some evidence that there was a dynasty, and it was known as the House of David. Unlike some of the other things that I showed you, this doesn't come out of the antiquities market. It comes from a controlled dig, someplace where we can actually discover it and know where it came from. Dead Sea Scrolls, obviously. 1946, they have copies of every book of the Old Testament, with the exception of Esther, and they have some other things. Has completely opened up our understanding of Jewish history and theology in this period, and to this day, they are still impacting our understanding of the New Testament, translation, and language. It can't be understated how important this discovery was. The Thanatos inscription, the death inscription. Death, I like death, that sounds good, right? Okay. Nowhere is this mentioned in the Bible. But it is mentioned in Josephus and some other sources. In the temple in Jerusalem, there was a wall around the actual temple building itself known as the balustrade. And we are told that there was a sign on there in Greek, and it said, basically, all Gentiles who passed by this barrier do so at risk of their own lives. Here in the late 1800s, this inscription was discovered. There's actually two of them discovered. This one is in Istanbul, so that picture is mine. That's what I did on my study leave, what I did on my summer vacation, okay? It's not mentioned in the New Testament, but how does it fill out the New Testament? Well, in Acts chapter 27, we know that a riot starts in the temple because Paul is accused of taking Gentiles into the temple. Did it mean that he actually went into the building? No. He's perhaps being accused of taking them beyond this wall with this inscription. Also, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14 says that Christ has broken down the barrier wall between Jew and Gentile. It may be alluding to this inscription on the wall. Caiaphas, the high priest. This may be the ossuary that belonged to the man who put Jesus on trial and was high priest when he was crucified. Now, why this one as opposed to the other ones? First of all, it's a very richly ornated, look at that, compared to even ours. Okay? So obviously this was owned by somebody who was rich. And the other thing is out of all the people that we know from that period, we only know one Caiaphas. So is this that Caiaphas? It's quite possible. But nobody who's going to do history correctly is going to say 100% sure. But it's possible. Be interesting. We don't have James's ossuary Mary. We don't have Yossi's or Jesus. We've got Caiaphas's perhaps. Yochanan ben Hakol. What you are looking at is our only evidence for crucifixion, somebody being nailed for crucifixion. We know that crucifixion happened quite a bit, but because we don't have the remains, people began to question, well, did they really nail people to the cross, or did they just tie them there? And then they discovered this ossuary in a tomb, and this is the ankle bone of somebody who was crucified. Okay? Does it prove the crucifixion? No, but it helps us to understand and demonstrate at least the validity of nailing somebody to the cross was not something that was below the Romans. Finally, the Gallio inscription. This is an inscription. It's actually broken up into many pieces. And what's significant about this is it actually is found in the city of Delphi in ancient Greece. And it lists out all the various governors in the regions. And it tells us about this guy named Gallio who was the proconsul in Corinth. We know, according to Acts 18, that Paul stood before Gallio when he was on trial in Corinth. And that helps us to then secure the date for Paul's visit to Corinth between 50 and 52 AD. Sometime in that period. Because we know that was the 2-year time period that he was serving there as proconsul. In closing then, when you go home and you get your copy of, I'd say Newsweek, but they're not printing anymore, are they? Okay. Time, whatever, Discovery Channel, everything else that's coming out. When you're watching these things, and they've got the next find, the next manuscript, the next piece of archaeology that's going to prove or disprove the Bible. If it's too good to be true, it probably is. Now, doesn't mean that too good to be true automatically dismiss that, okay, it can't possibly be true. But I think as you see, quite often that is the case. Okay? Maybe we will find the Ark of Covenant. I doubt it. Beware of what I call the zeitgeist discoveries. Fancy German phrase for the spirit of the age. It's interesting that when Da Vinci Code came out in novel form and then movie, suddenly the Talpiot tomb was being reinterpreted as Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married. All right? All of a sudden we have a gospel of Jesus' wife where Jesus says, my wife, for the very first time. If this seems to fit in a little too well with other stuff that's going on, be very suspicious. Remember that the goal of archaeology is never actually to prove or disprove the Bible. If you start out with that as your presupposition, it's probably going to lead you in whichever direction you want it to go. The goal of archaeology is to go to a site, uncover it, and let it teach us what it has to say to us by seeing what we find. Finally, remember, though, that what archaeology really does for us is it takes us out of the text and into the world of the Bible. It helps us to understand what we perhaps didn't know and see things that we can't see just simply by reading a text. Thank you. Take some questions if you have any. Yes, sir. Scott, right? Look at that. You can do it. The top two. Watch your eyes. All right, yes, Scott?
Ask you to comment on two different things. One, seals and bullseye, how do they figure it, especially if they seem to refer to officials that are in the scriptural text? And the other is, do you have any comment or opinion on secret mark?
Okay. You know, I actually thought about putting secret mark in this. Yeah, it is, exactly. Seals and bullae, these are clay. It's clay, you know, the way you see when people would actually take wax, and even in this country, and do it. They used to do that with clay, and they would have a seal. We actually have seals from scribes that are mentioned in the book of Jeremiah as well as 2 Kings. These names are there. We have tombs that seem to match up. Again, the names. At that point, when you have a name that seems to be unique, it seems to fit in that time period, as a good historian, what you say is, it looks as if we have this. When you start developing stories on it, that's where you go wrong. Secret mark. Remember I told you a story about Coleman Norton, who found the teeth will be provided? Morton Smith claimed that he found a secret Gospel of Mark in a monastery outside of Bethlehem, that he copied this and that he brought it back. And in this secret Gospel of Mark, Jesus is there, and some young man shows up naked and spends the night with Jesus. It doesn't say anything funny goes on there, but you can see where this is going. The problem is, most people have never seen this, and we don't know where it is today. And so there's a lot of suspicion in the scholarly field that this thing is another forgery. The problem is there's also a lot of people who have spilt a lot of ink over this and their career rides on it. So they're going to protect this as much as they can. Scholars are like squids. When they're in trouble, they squirt ink. Okay? In the back. Peter?
Yeah. There's something about the Talpiot tomb that originally dismissed it for being authentic, since it took 20-some years for them to really start reconsidering, or the Discovery Channel people and Cameron to start saying it was legit. So was there something that automatically made people question?
Well, the tomb is legit.
Right.
It was the interpretation. I think the naked archaeologist, we knew that we had this tomb with the names Jesus, son of Joseph, things like that. The archaeologists have been accused of suppressing the information. Partly they did that because they knew as soon as you release a thing that says Jesus, son of Joseph, and you knew this was going to happen. But the other thing is, these names are so common, why would anybody want to make those conclusions? But somehow, I don't know what led them to this other than mammon, money. Yes, sir?
Why the necessity for forgeries when those people know that they're forgeries?
When there are people who know they are?
Yes.
Some of these people are very, very good at these forgeries. They've actually got to the point that they've realized that these people can actually mimic what is known as patina, which is the chemical residue that develops over time on the object in the tomb from pollen. These guys are actually reproducing this quite well. There's money to be made. When you can sell a pomegranate 2 inches high for $550,000 to the Israel Museum, why not, you know? Another thing is politics. I didn't mention this, but finding proof that there was ever a Jewish temple on the Temple Mount would work in favor of the Israelis in the peace process, because right now the Palestinians, for political reasons, will not ever admit that there was a temple on top of the Temple Mount. Okay? Even though all our sources tell us that. So for politics reasons, if I can find a stone that supposedly proves that, maybe I can use that as a wedge in peace negotiations. One more? Wow, I got off easy. All right, well, thank you. Please take a chance to go to the museum.
Express our gratitude.